Hi, my name is Andrea. If this is your first time here, welcome. If you are returning, thank you so much and welcome back. What I do on this channel is I explore what it's like to go all through your 20s and all through your 30s being either child-free or child-free by choice, as I was, and then navigating the major relationship identity and personal shifts that come when becoming a mother later in life. Now, I personally became a mom at 40 with my first child. I'm now 33 weeks pregnant with my second child. And before I had a baby, I was a very strongly motivated person who was very career oriented. I was child free by choice. And adamantly child free by choice until I wasn't. And now what I'm going to talk about is what it's like to become a mom later in life and what that's like going from being so career focused to being really motherly focused. And today what I want to talk about is advocating for my child's no. So what motivated this particular episode is because I've actually run into it a few times where I feel very strongly that it is important to not only encourage but advocate and be a staunch protector of my daughter's ability to say no. Say no when it comes to anybody touching her body, including me, sharing her toys necessarily, or just being able to have a little bit of autonomy over herself when it matters. Now, there are times, of course, where she doesn't get to have a say in whether or not she gets a choice, right? Like, for instance, some non-negotiables exist out there. She does have to go to bed. She does have to brush her teeth. She does have to take a bath. She does have to eat at times. Like, we don't force her to eat any particular food, but we do, tell her like, oh, if it's too late at night, the kitchen's now closed. So she doesn't always get a choice over certain things. But the one thing I do want her always to have a choice over is whether or not somebody else touches her body. And if something is hers, like we have given it to her and it is hers, she gets to choose whether or not to share it. So we don't force sharing, and we don't want her to be forced into letting other people touch her. And so let's talk about what that means to defend your kids' no. So my daughter now is 2 years and 8 months, and her default to everything, Hazel, can I give you a hug? No. Hazel, are you hungry? No. Hazel, do you want to get in the car ride? No. Her default is always no. Then she thinks about it. And a lot of times we'll say yes, or we'll then decide to share, or then we'll decide that she does want something. But she always starts with the negative and then decides if she wants to do something or not do something. How many of us, myself included, oftentimes start with a yes and then wish we hadn't? Like, oh, can you help volunteer for this thing? Sure. Or, hey, can you build this thing for us? Yes. And then we say yes, and then put ourselves into a situation where we're like, we actually don't have the bandwidth, time, effort, or energy to put into the thing we just agreed to. So what if we all started with a no first and then backtracked into a yes? I find that it's always easier to backtrack into a yes than to commit to something and say, oh, I changed my mind. I'm sorry, I can't do that. So let's talk about some of the ways and why it's important to advocate for your child's no. So why their no matters. Starting young, children have an innate ability to say no without necessarily worrying about the feelings of other people because they haven't been taught that kind of codependence yet. That and their brains aren't quite there yet, right? So their no now, early, is their initial teachings for being able to say no later in life. If we untrain the no early, on purpose or inadvertently, they're not going to regain it in the same way as if they always had it. So having them have the ability to say no now means that they're going to have a stronger ability to say no later. And that's what I want. I want an adult version of my daughter who is not afraid to use her no because she knows what's best for her first. So it just teaches self-respect, it teaches self-autonomy, and it teaches her also to decide whether or not to give someone else consent versus starting with a yes and then backing off into a no. So I have seen this in multiple scenarios, but what happens when we mock our kids' no? It's like, hey, can I share that with you? No. Oh, what, you don't share with me now? Because, or we try to like push back on them a little bit, or maybe we take food without asking, or we just disrespect them as human beings and mock them for having the ability to say no, and then we expect them to be strong adults who say no later in life, even though the safe people in their world, who it could be like close friends, relatives, parents, whoever, mocked their no early. So if your inner circle of people didn't respect your kids' no, didn't strongly advocate for it, and didn't encourage it early, why would a kid who has learned not to say no to the safe and close people in their life, why would they do it with the people that are in their outer circle? We, as the inner circle for our kids, teach them what it's like to be able to flex those muscles. And so that way, if you have a strong advocate for the no within your inner circle, they're going to know what it feels like for it to be weird when somebody in the outside world who will absolutely eventually disregard, disrespect, and downplay the no, right? Like, I want my young daughter to have a strong no now, so that way if somebody later in her life, even now in her life, when they disrespect her no, I want her to know, K-N-O-W, that feels weird. To have somebody disrespect your no is an abnormal thing for another person to do. But if we teach them that it's normal to disregard their feelings, disregard their no, disregard their bodily autonomy at a young age, why would they all of a sudden magically develop the ability to be able to discern later if it wasn't taught early? I don't know. I've run into like scenarios where it's been explained to me that they believe that's what happens, and I just don't. I believe you teach a strong no now to preserve a strong no later. I would love your feedback or thoughts in the comments, because I feel like this shouldn't be controversial, but might be a little bit. One of the things that I use as a barometer for figuring out whether or not the situation is appropriate for my kiddo is, would I do this to another adult? So let's say that my kid had something and I wanted to share it with her, and she said no, and I was like, but come on, I really want that thing. Or if some other adult said, hey, I really want that thing, would you have done that to another adult? So let's say another adult, you wanted something from another adult. Let's say you wanted to drink of their water, or you wanted, and I'm picking like things that are a little more intimate. So you wanted to drink of their water, you wanted a bite of their food, you wanted to sit on their lap, okay, or you wanted them to sit on your lap, and they said no. Would you then turn around to that other adult and say, hey, you're really hurting my feelings by not sharing with me, or oh, you're making me so sad because you're not sitting on my lap, and you're really hurting my feelings. I've heard this from adults where they're like, oh, but I really want a hug, or I really want you to sit on my lap, or I really want, for you to share my food. And if you wouldn't do that to another adult because you realize you're disrespecting their personal autonomy and decision making, why would you then try to change the mind or manipulate the answer of a child in order to get your way as the adult? All you're doing is teaching them to undermine their own personal needs and preferences in order to make another person happy. So what you're teaching is people pleasing, what you're teaching is codependence, and what you're teaching is that kid's feelings, that kid's autonomy, that kid's things don't actually matter as much as the feelings or preferences of another person. And when an adult does it to a child, what that child is learning is that their feelings, their preferences, their desires are not as important as another adult's. And then when you mock their feelings, what you're teaching them is that your feelings don't matter as much as my desires. And I can't think of a more dangerous message to send a child, even especially a young girl. Your feelings about what you do with your body, what you do with your things, what you do with your feelings are not as important as my desires as the adult. So if you don't sit on my lap, you're going to hurt my feelings. If you don't share your food with me, you're going to hurt my feelings. If you don't do this, you're going to hurt my feelings, and I'm going to try to make you feel guilty. I realize that a lot of people do this not with malintent. They do it as a form of play. But what they don't know is, even though it's play and they think it's teasing, you're still teaching the child to say yes after they've said no, which teaches them to disregard themselves and their own feelings and their desires, which then again is going to translate later in life. And then what happens when you're now 2.5-year-old that was taught not to respect their own desires and wishes becomes a 17 years old, let's say, and they're getting pressured from another person, either much older or the same age, to then again be like, hey, if you don't come sit on my lap, you're going to hurt my feelings. If you don't hold your body against mine, you're going to hurt my feelings. If you don't share the things that are yours and intimate with me, you're going to hurt my feelings. And so what are they going to draw back on? Their early training where they learned how to say no strongly and advocate for themselves? Or are they going to draw back on their early training where they were taught to disregard their feelings, wants, and desires in order to people please another person? I would rather err on the side of learning how to say no and not to people please. So that way you don't end up putting yourself in a situation or doing something or sharing something that you regret. I don't want her to ever share something that she didn't want to and have regret. So I think that's really, really important. What's interesting is sometimes when little children say no, it really triggers adults. And I think, I am not a psychologist. This is not coming from a place of like research or anything like that. This is just personal opinion. And I think that what happens is when a kid says no to an adult and it triggers that adult was very likely not allowed to say no when they were a child. And what they're doing is they're playing out the ways in which they were treated. And that was not fair to that adult either. That adult should have been allowed to say no. That adult should have been allowed to have autonomy over their own feelings. But because they weren't taught any differently, the cycle perpetuates. And so they were teased when they said no, so they will tease when a child says no. And it takes a lot of self-work and reflection to say, hey, I don't actually, this isn't a generational lesson I want to perpetuate. What I want is to realize that I was not respected as a child in the ways I deserved, but what I want to do is pass down a new family tree of children and girls being able to say no when it comes to their bodies, their things, their desires, right? The ability to say no is such a strong tool and skill. And I would rather teach a kid how to say no harshly and maybe even a little rudely, and then back it up and teach politeness versus force politeness before they really understand it on a cognitive level, and then just teach them that, no matter what you do, you should always people please other people. Now, does that mean you can never tease a child? No, I tease my daughter constantly, and I'll say I'm just teasing. So, for example, she will say, hey mom, do you want to share my, and it's usually a food item, do you want to share my banana with me? And she'll look at me and like have this really kind of devious smile on her face. And I'll say, yes, I want to share your banana. And I'll run over to her and I'll say, okay, I'm ready to have a big bite of your banana. And she'll go, no, it's mine. And I go, you know what? It is yours. And be like, and then I'll just kind of like lean over and she'll hold it away from me and play. And I'll be like, honey, you're right. I'm not going to take your banana, or I'm not going to take your thing. But she'll like want to tease me with it. I'll come over there and then she wants to say no. And then I will instantaneously say, that's yours. You don't have to share it. And then we're just going back and forth. The challenging part is when she wants to do this with other kids and they don't actually understand. So she will say like, do you want to play with it? And they'll come over and say yes. And then she'll say no. And then they'll just kind of they'll be like, oh, okay, never mind. And they'll lose interest in wanting to play with her in that way. So I try to explain to her like, yes, we can tease mama that way, but if you offer something to somebody and then you say no, they're not going to want to play with you in the same way. Which maybe that's not the world's best or the most strategic strategy, but I would rather her learn that saying no after offering to share has a social consequence than codependently sharing, if that makes sense. But yes, teasing, I think you can tease You can tease skillfully, but you don't have to tease in a way that disregards their autonomy or their feelings. And other things I'll do is I'll be like, okay, if you know, I'm gonna come tickle your toes, and she'll be like, don't tickle my toes, and I say, okay, I won't. And then she'll go, yes, tickle my toes, and so then I know I'm getting consent. And then I'll tickle her toes, and she'll say no, and then I'll back off and leave her alone for a minute, or I'll just sit by her, and then if she gives it, like, if she puts her feet back on me so I can tickle her toes, I'll do it again. But I'm always trying to make sure that when she says no, even if she's saying no teasing, that I take it very seriously, so then that she learns that when she says no, other people are supposed to instantly back off. And if she wants to keep playing after saying no, then I re-engage her by making sure that I have her consent again. Okay, I'm going to tickle your toes. No, then I don't. It's like, so maybe I'll just come up and tease her as if I'm going to, and she says no, and then I'll instantly back off. Same with my husband, who will play with her, tease her, hold her, and then if at any point she says, you know, put me down, whatever, we instantaneously stop doing whatever it is, so that she knows that when she says no, we take it seriously as soon as she says it. Which I think is really important. It doesn't mean we don't get to play with her. It doesn't mean we don't get to, like, wrestle with her. It doesn't mean we don't get to do any of those things. But it does mean that she gets to kind of dictate how, when she gets a little bit overstimulated, or if she's ready for a break, that she gets to decide that when hands come off, because they are her body. But we're also trying to teach her the same in reverse. Being like, you don't get to touch other people without permission. You don't get to hug other people without permission. And just trying to make sure that she understands that consent goes both ways. It's kind of a big subject for such a young kid, but I'd rather introduce it early than introduce it too late. And so one of the things that I think is really important to talk about is I am so grateful that I became an older mom in my 40s versus trying to navigate this in my 20s. So in my 20s and in my 30s, I was still very in the mindset of trying to make sure that I was taking care of other people and getting their approval more than I was worried about my inner sense of peace and autonomy. And I think that just came with part of it with age, part of it with counseling, part of it with having a really strong partner who is also on the same page with me and being able to advocate for my daughter's no. Because he knows that she needs to be able to practice no on the men in her life, so that way she can practice no on the men that come into her life, if that makes sense. So being older has definitely brought me perspective. I've been able to think a lot more. My ego's not as, I don't know if the word is fragile or like developing, but because I've had a little bit of life and I have said yes to things, whether it be work projects, personal projects, volunteering, whatever, when I wish I would have said no, I have now learned, yes, I want the ability for her to say yes when she wants to say yes and means no, yes, and no when she wants to say no and means no. So I hope this was helpful for anybody who's out there just kind of wondering. And I do this for a couple reasons. One, I want her to have a strong no. Two, I don't want her to be an easy target for somebody who might want to do something nefarious to her. I want her to know that her body is hers, and we are also at this age, and I'm not going into this so much in this video, but teaching her all the proper names of her body parts, and then who can and cannot help her when it comes to going to the bathroom, taking a bath, anything like that. So that way she knows that if somebody was to touch her where they were in a private part, you know, and they weren't one of her safe people, or they weren't one of the people that were responsible for her intimately, then that would be weird. So I would love your comments. I wanted to try to get this out. My daughter's napping. I probably have to go back in and make sure that she's doing well. But it's really important to me. And I think that children learn how to say no, because they don't always get to say no. But learning how to say no when it matters, when they have the choice, when they have the, when they should have the ability to say no, and to be a staunch advocate for it as one of the close adults in their lives, is a way that we make strong adults who are hopefully less people pleasers going forward. Thank you. Please leave a comment and have a great day. Bye.